Hello, everybody. My name is Dratnos, and welcome to this Mythic Plus Week Analyzed. This week's affixes are Sanguine, Quaking, and Fortified, and of course, Awakened. This is a pretty good set of affixes, and this is one of the best sets of affixes on the calendar for very, very, very high level teams. That's because Sanguine and Quaking, neither one of them actually adds any damage or health to the dungeon if they're played around properly. They require some work to play around. If something goes wrong with one of them, or if you get like an unfortunate Quaking overlap in specific spots in some dungeons, yes, they can be very punishing. Sanguine can be hugely costly in terms of time if it's done wrong. So that can be tough this week, but the good news is if you do the whole dungeon and play around the affixes properly, you don't lose any time at all to them. And that makes it a really, really good week for trying to push the highest keys on Radar.io. So this week, many teams are going to be doing just that. Myself and Tettles actually we're going to be streaming pretty much the whole week, just broadcasting and providing coverage of that action. So stop by my stream and his stream, mostly my stream. If you're on my YouTube channel, come to my stream, watch that. It should be pretty fun. We'll be going most hours of the day this week. If you're not one of those top level groups, if you're somebody who's just out there pushing Radar.io score or just trying to do some weekly keys this week, thinking about doing Mythic Plus this week, it's not a bad week either, but it is tricky. It's tricky mostly because Sanguine is here. And Sanguine is a week that, especially for some groups, especially if you're lacking certain classes, it can be difficult to deal with that affix unless your tank in particular is thinking ahead. If your tank is thinking ahead, you really don't need any abilities to deal with Sanguine. If your tank isn't thinking ahead, then the difference between a group that has access to something like Typhoon and the group that doesn't is going to be massive. So when thinking about what classes to play, or at least what talents to pick for those classes, stuff like Shining Force, Typhoon, Thunderstorm, extremely valuable this week. Engineering, if you're an engineer, you can actually put a knock belt attachment on, so you can enchant your belt such that you can knock one target back every 10 minutes. And that is very valuable this week also, because often there's only one or two key Sanguine moments in a dungeon where there's some stupid caster that will not move unless you knock it that is in Sanguine, and if it's at 10% health and it's in a Sanguine puddle, the difference between knocking it and not knocking it can be a minute at times, and that can be really, really massive. So do consider that, especially if you're going to be in a group that doesn't have access to one of those things. Quaking this week. Quaking, not such a bad affix because it no longer does guaranteed damage. So especially in highly coordinated groups, Quaking is basically gonna not actually slow down your dungeon at all, nor is it going to do any damage to your group. But if you're in a lower level group, especially if you're in a dungeon with confined corridors like Waycross Manor, Toldegor, then Quaking can be pretty tough this week. And that's a challenge as well, because those dungeons are also ones where Sanguine is at its worst, because you have less space to drop the Sanguine as well. So Waycross Manor, Toldegor are great examples of dungeons that are just narrow corridors. And in Toldegor, there's not too much you can do about it. In Waycrest Manor, there are open spaces that you can pull back to. So my strategy in Waycrest this week would be to always just pull back to the most recently cleared open area. So, you're doing Waycrest Manor or whatever, you've cleaned out the courtyard. Instead of fighting this hallway here, just grab some packs and pull them back out to the courtyard. Fight them there. And that way you're keeping your Sanguine in a place where it's manageable, and you're fighting enemies in a spot where Quaking isn't going to kill you. So that's my strategy for that dungeon this week. In terms of big winners and losers for dungeons this week, nothing extremely jumps out to me as a great dungeon for this week. It seems like kind of a pretty good week everywhere. The dungeon that I would be most worried about, besides ones where just, the Sanguine is going to get you in trouble like this, is actually, well, it is a dungeon that is because of Sanguine, but it's Siege of Borealis. Siege of Borealis is one where I'm terrified of this sort of week for this dungeon for most groups. You have all of this annoyance of Sanguine. You have all these mobs that flee into Sanguine. You have all these mobs that, are difficult to control. You have this strategy that a lot of groups use of trying to kill people with the spotter, right? Trying to kill enemies with the spotter. And that works really well if the spotter can be buffed up with something like Raging or Bolstering. But even if you can't, it can be pretty effective. But when you have something like Sanguine going on, then all of a sudden, if you're grouping up 5 mobs and you kill, 3 of them with one spotter explosion, and you can't kill the next immediately, then they're going to full heal, and it starts to get really awkward. Stuff starts to live a really long time. And mobs are just pretty uncooperative in this dungeon, and that's a real problem for Sanguine. So I'd say Siege of Borealis, you may see some of the top teams putting up respectable Siege of Borealis times, but I doubt it's going to be as good as like Bolstering Week was for this dungeon. because for those groups, bolstering is actually kind of a plus, not a minus. And I don't think you're going to see anybody real. I think most groups are going to have a really hard time in this dungeon this week. So if this is one of the dungeons that you have available to your group, I'd watch out for it. Motherlode, I think, is also kind of in that category. Motherlode, just a really tough Sanguine dungeon because of like mechanized peacekeepers just loving to stand still in Sanguine for 10 seconds and heal all the way up to full. So this is a dungeon where that is really the key challenge of the dungeon is just the Sanguine management there. If you can do that well, it can be a pretty good dungeon, but it's very hard to do that well for the whole dungeon. So extremely scary dungeon this week. Anyways, that's my analysis of some of the dungeons this week, some of the specs and stuff that are going to do well. Check out my video. So in the description below, you can find a video where I actually go through the routes for all these dungeons this week. That was 12 weeks ago that I made that, and that video definitely still holds. So do check that one out if you're interested in that kind of content. Otherwise, thanks everybody for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.